I now have the honor of introducing a dear friend of the Foundation and a remarkable scholar, Dr. Bernard Wood. Dr. Wood is University Professor of Human Origins and Director of the Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology at George Washington University. He is the author or co-author of 12 books and over 220 scientific articles and book chapters. Dr. Wood was the keynote speaker at the Leakey Foundation's 2013 Public Symposium in Cleveland and has been a guest lecturer for our National Speaker Series in Chicago and San Francisco. While traveling for the Speaker Series, he visited a number of local schools and also helped the Foundation organize a series of school outreach programs in Washington, D.C. He was featured in episode 7 of our podcast Origin Stories, and his episode has been downloaded over 15,000 times. In January of last year, right before the pandemic struck, Dr. Wood joined the Foundation on a special tour of London and Charles Darwin's home in Down. And as you can see in this wonderful photo of him and Camilla, he is great fun to be with. Please welcome tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Bernard Wood.
Thank you very much for giving me this rather awesome responsibility. If my talk was a dish, the ingredients are more or less the following. Maybe a teaspoon of history, a tablespoon of science, and a quart of love and affection and thanks to Camilla. So the first slide, the last day I saw Camilla before now was at Charles Darwin's house. And there is a picture of the visiting group standing in front of the house in the portico that you can see on the left. The bottom right is a photograph of Charles Darwin taken in 1881. And this is a picture taken in 1882. And the physician in me would suggest that he doesn't look as well as he did in 1881. And he actually died in 1882. And we are within just a few days of the 139th anniversary of his funeral. He died on the 19th of April, and he was buried on April the 26th. He's buried in Westminster Abbey next to Sir John Herschel, and just a stride away from Newton's grave. You ask yourself, how did a man who was not known for his religiosity end up being buried in Westminster Abbey? And Camilla, we visited the graveyard of the church in Down, which is where he wanted to be buried. But his friends managed to persuade his wife that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey. That was quite an effort because of his lack of evidence of religiosity. The Dean of Westminster was away in France, traveling, and there is a very interesting monograph which describes everything that took place that resulted in his burial in Westminster Abbey. The 11 years before he died, he published the Descent of Man. And in it, he suggested that modern humans were more closely related to the African apes than to the orangutan. And these two gentlemen, Emil Zuckerkandl and Maurice Goodman, contributed molecular evidence to back up that conclusion, which was largely based on gross morphology. Emil Zuckerkandl used hemoglobin. He broke it up with enzymes. He used two-way chromatography to look at the peptides. And if you look at the top two images, you can see that the peptide, the pattern of peptides in modern humans and chimpanzees is very similar and is different from the pattern you see in gorillas and orangs. Maurice Goodman used a different method. He used immunological methods, and what he did was to focus not on hemoglobin but on albumin. And if you just focus on the top 4 of those 8 images, you can. What he did was that he took a small amount of albumin, chimpanzee albumin, he injected it into a monkey. It was small enough amount not to upset the monkey. He collected the anti-chimp antibodies from the monkey, and he put it in the bottom of the 3 wells. Those dark squares are wells in a gel. And so the anti-chimp antibodies in the bottom well, and chimp albumin and gorilla albumin are in the wells on the top left, and chimp and human, chimp and gibbon, chimp and orang. And you can see that if the albumin and the antibodies to the albumin are the same, to the same molecule, there's just a smooth white line. If there is a difference, you see a white spur, and you can see a substantial white spur when you compare chimps and gibbons, another one when you compare chimps and orangs, a slightly smaller one when you compare chimps and gorillas, but no spur when you compare chimps and humans. And so these 2 scientists provided in the 1960s molecular evidence that sort of backed up the evidence from gross morphology. There is a gentleman in a smaller photograph. I just want to tell you a little about him. His name, his publication, the publication I'm going to tell you about, was by Albert Grünbaum. But the reason I found it very difficult to find much about him was that he changed his name to Leighton, because during the First World War in England, it was not a good idea to be called Grünbaum. It's not a good reflection on my country. So why am I talking about him? He published a letter in the Lancet in 1902, which reports some experiments he did using what he calls anti-serum, which he prepared by injecting the serum of an animal into the peritoneal cavity of a rabbit. And if you inject human serum into the peritoneal cavity of a rabbit, and then you collect some blood from the rabbit, that is what's called anti-serum. Now, if you inject human serum into the rabbit, and then you match it with human serum, what we now know were antibodies that were generated by the injection into the peritoneal cavity. They react with the serum, and you get an agglutination. Basically, if the anti-serum matches the serum, you get a substantial agglutination. He managed to get some serum from some animals from a zoo in Manchester. And so he had chimpanzee serum and gorilla serum and orang serum. And basically, to cut a long story short, he noticed that when you did this reaction, there was a slight difference between the reaction you got when you used orang than when you used the gorillas and the serum from chimpanzees and gorillas. So basically in 1902, he demonstrated the molecular affinity between modern humans and chimpanzees and gorillas, and that they were closer to modern humans than orangs. This is almost certainly the first use of what was called serology to compare a modern human with a chimpanzee, a gorilla, and an orang. And it was, and this is largely lost in the literature, although Maurice Goodman mentions the work of Nuttall And if you go back to Nuttall's work, he in turn mentions Grünbaum. What is really distressing was that I spent 17 years in Liverpool and I knew nothing about Albert Grünbaum. We know that he must have changed his name between 1902 and 1917 because that's the first publication that he uses the name later. Now, with the work, the use of DNA to explore relationships among modern humans and the African and the Asian apes, we now know that modern humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to gorillas. Not exactly sure how long modern humans and chimpanzees and bonobos were independent of gorillas before modern humans and chimpanzees and bonobos split, but that there is now substantial amount of evidence to suggest that these are the relationships among modern humans and the great apes. And to my mind, this is one of the major contributions to human evolution research in the last few decades. It's actually giving us the branching pattern of the tree of life. Not all of the relationships are necessarily reflected by this branching pattern. There are some things in which modern humans are closer to gorillas, but this is basically the shape of the branching pattern of the tree of life, which I think is a major step forward. When I was doing my PhD back in the Neolithic, these were the hominins that were known, and they were taught to me in a course that I did with Michael Day in 1966. The textbook I used was The Fossil Evidence for Human Evolution by Sir Wilfrid McGraw Clark, and it was 142 pages, modest sized book that you can put in your pocket. Now, in 2021, things look a lot busier, and we know that the more rocks are available, the more sediments that are exposed, it's called rock availability. And the more time people spend investigating those rocks, more likely it is that hominins will be discovered. Now, at the top left of this diagram are modern humans. And basically, most of the world, I guess for good reasons, are interested in the ancestors of modern humans. Now we know that, well, at least most of us accept that the fossil record of the hominin fossil record includes not just ancestors, but it includes non-ancestral close relatives. And I am particularly enamored with a non-ancestral close relative. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. And I know that Camilla's interested in what it means to be human. Clearly, it's interesting to say, what does it mean not to be human? In other words, what is this close relative like that, that is related to us, but is almost certainly not our ancestor? And so what I want to talk about is Paranthropus Boisea. And you can see it's a column here over on the right. The bottom of the column is called the first appearance date, which reflects the earliest fossils. And the top of the column is the last appearance date that reflects the most recent fossils. And so I just want to spend a bit of time telling you about my favorite hominin. Well, the story starts, like so many stories in Olduvai Gorge. The story starts in 1955 with the discovery of this large deciduous maxillary molar. We know it's deciduous because the roots are splayed like that, and that you see that in deciduous teeth. Despite the fact that Louis Leakey described it as a mandibular molar, it's quite surely a deciduous maxillary molar. This was found in 1955 Lamentably, there isn't a scale in this image, but you just have to take my word for it that it's big. And so the Leakeys were in search of the makers of the old of the stone tools found in the lower beds at Olduvai Gorge. And the only hominin they had found had these chunky, huge milk molars, which is not what they were sort of looking for. They were looking for something, hopefully, that was more likely to belong to an ancestor, a direct ancestor of modern humans. Mary Leakey in 1959 discovered that the palate here of a hominin, and she discovered fragments of its cranial vault. And here is the excavation. And so they were so excited by this that they did this huge excavation, but they didn't recover any more of this individual. They just recovered the cranium. Now, when I say just, it's a pretty magnificent specimen. The mandible is manufactured. It's just made out of plaster so they could mount the cranium to take the photographs. But you can see it's a really strange creature. Here is a picture of the palate, and it's got huge molars and premolars. They are the large teeth at the bottom, and really small canines and incisors. They are the teeth at the top. You can see that despite the enamel cap of these teeth being the most substantial of any early hominid, despite this thick enamel cap, the enamel is worn away. If you look at the premolars, you can see dentine is exposed. And if you look at the first molar, there are various places where dentine is exposed. So despite having thick enamel, the enamel's worn away. A modern human, if you look at your little fingernail, that's about the size of your first mandibular or maxillary molar tooth. To give you some idea of just how big these teeth are, they're about the size of your thumbnail or my thumbnail. So these are huge teeth. So this is a strange creature. And despite its strangeness, the Leakeys sort of swallowed their pride. And this creature had a brief career as the likely maker of the old Derwent tools. But as soon as they began to discover what they came to call Homo habilis, the career of this individual as a toolmaker was cut short. And you can see here, this is a modern human maxilla at the bottom and the OH5 maxilla at the top. It's absolutely massive. Yet the canines are about the same size as they are in a modern human. They called it Paranthropus Boisea. And they called it Paranthropus Boisea after a man called Charles Boyes. And Charles Boyes was born in North Dakota. He went to the North Dakota School of Mines. He and his brother went off to Mexico to make their fortune as economic geologists. The photograph says October 1914. This was taken by Charles Boyes. By this time, he was working in Africa. He stayed working in Africa. He was involved in copper mining and in diamond mining. Basically, he made a pile of money. And he made so much money that he could virtually do whatever he wanted. The only thing he didn't do was to pay tax on the money. So he was an American citizen, but he hadn't paid tax on the money, and that's important. So here he is on the top right, looking at an estate which he bought called Emmett's. And you can see the house in the bottom. We tried to see it when we went to Down House, but we couldn't see it. The house is owned privately, but the gardens Charles Boyes gave to the National Trust. The two photographs in the middle on the left, there is Charles Boisea and his wife. His wife's looking daggers at him because according to Charles Boisea's niece, who I met, Charles had a mistress at the Savoy Hotel in London and spent the weekends at his house in Kent. The photograph in the middle on the right is Charles Boisea in the Waldorf Hotel in New York during the war. And basically, what was going on was that the Germans were trying to pass off fake industrial diamonds to harm the American industrial machine that was helping to support the war in Europe. And Charles Boisea was one of the few Americans that had any expertise in diamonds. And so he traded forgiveness of his tax debt to help sort real diamonds from fake diamonds. And that's what he's doing in the picture. He became a great Anglophile, and he paid cash for 2 Spitfires. And you can see those two. Actually, I'm not sure whether they're Spitfires or Hurricanes, so I don't want to mislead you. But he basically paid cash because the UK was pretty strapped for cash. It's a little like a citizen of the United States buying 2 fighter planes for the US Air Force. The next picture shows him receiving an honorary degree from the University of North Dakota, which used to be the North Dakota School of Mines. And on the picture on the left at the bottom is Charles Boisea with some of his pictures, and he was an avid collector of really good art. And so, why did they name it after Charles Boisea? Because when he was in Switzerland, because he liked to go curling, he noticed a letter in the Times from Louis Leakey lamenting how awful it was that the Americans were going to come with all their money and goods and scoop up all the best fossils from Kenya. And so Charles Boisea wrote to Louis Leakey and said, I'm very distressed to hear this, what can I do? Louis Leakey said, well, £1,000 would help us buy a lorry and a boat. And that resulted in the expedition to Lake Victoria, which resulted in Proconsul Africanus. So as a thank you, the Leakeys named their hominin after Charles Boisea. Not long after the discoveries in Olduvai, a mandible was discovered in Lake Natron, and you can see the mandible there. The teeth are worn, the enamel is worn away. The body of the mandible is very large. And Leslie Aiello and I looked at this and reckoned that the body of the mandible, the Paranthropus Boisea, is about 3 times the cross-sectional area of an individual of an equivalent body weight of a chimpanzee or a modern human. So these large molar teeth were embedded in this large mandibular corpus. The molar teeth, the molars and the premolars are doing everything to try and enlarge the area devoted to chewing. They are increasing in size at the back, which is the opposite of what happens in modern humans and in chimps. In other words, the molars were getting larger as you go back. And the premolars were becoming molarized. When you look at the roots, they look as if they are molar roots. And so this is clearly a strange creature. It's not only got these large chewing teeth, but perhaps in order to aid chewing, because you can't chew effectively if your canines project above the tooth row, it's got really small canines. And the canines show very little in the way of dimorphism. And so you ask yourself, what's going on here? Well, more evidence of Paranthropus boisei came from Lake Turkana, and this is one of the early aerial photographs. And among the evidence from Lake Turkana were some fossils. What's on the left is a cranium of a presumed male Paranthropus boisei, and what's on the right is a cranium of a smaller bodied presumed female Paranthropus Boisea. So you have this strange puzzle of a hominin that has quite substantial dimorphism, sexual dimorphism in body mass, yet hardly any canine dimorphism. Now, other than hominins, other primates that are sexually dimorphic in body mass, they display canines as a way of establishing rank order among males and males trying to attract females. So what was going on in Paranthropus Boisea? You have substantial body mass, sexual dimorphism, but you don't have the signaling mechanism that is used by every other higher primate. Were they doing this? Did they have skin flanges, or I don't know, but it's just one of the things that fascinates me about Paranthropus Boisea. And just to remind you, there's not a snowball's chance in hell that this is an ancestor of modern humans. It's a side branch, it's within hominins, but it's a side branch. Here on the top left is looking down on the top of the Paranthropus Boisea cranium. And on the right is looking down on the top of a Homo erectus or Homo ergaster cranium, which is found in more or less the same level of Cubifora. So these two creatures were sort of coexisting. That's not to say they were both standing behind each other in the line at the local 7-Eleven, but they were both in the Turkana Basin at more or less the same time. There is the mandible from Peninsula, just to remind you what the mandibles look like. And on the right is a radiograph that we took in the Susan Abbott and I took. And you can see that the root of the M2 is on the left, the root of the M1 is in the middle, and the root of the P4 is on the right. Actually, the root of the P4 is more molar-like and larger than the root of the M1. Just a story about the radiographs. We managed to get an X-ray machine that had been discarded by Nairobi Hospital. I brought some X-ray film from the UK. We tried to take some pictures. It wasn't successful. We got rather frustrated, so I turned all the knobs on the X-ray machine up to maximum. We started it, went off to have a cup of tea from the Duca that used to be by the museum, and came back and got this absolutely fabulous film, quite by chance. I would like to tell you that it was the result of a lot of considered mathematics and so on, but it was quite by chance. What we know about the timing of Boisea very largely comes from work of the French group and the American group, and I'm showing you these pictures of Clark Howell because of his long association with the Leakey Foundation. And as a result of this work, the first evidence of Paranthropus Boisea sensu stricto is about 2.3 million years, and the most recent evidence is about 1.4 million years. The question is, what does that mean? Because essentially the oldest fossils from the Homo determine the bottom of his column, and the youngest fossils from the Homo and some fossils from Olduvai Gorge determine the top of the column. So can you look at this column and say, we need to find some explanation for the emergence of Paranthropus Boisea? And you look at the top of this column and you say, we need to find some explanation for its disappearance. Well, we just need to think about that, because fossil sites are places where you find hominin fossils. Hominins must have lived there, otherwise you wouldn't find their fossils. But just because you find them there, it doesn't mean the hominins weren't elsewhere. We know they were there, but we don't know they weren't elsewhere. And I know I'm beginning to sound like Donald Rumsfeld's infamous speech at the Defense Department, where he talked about knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns, that we should know that the bottom of this column is unlikely to be the first time that Paranthropus Boisea stepped on the earth, and the top of the column is not likely to be the last time that Paranthropus Boisea stepped on the earth. We need to remind ourselves that where we find hominins covers a pretty small percentage of the surface area of the African continent. And so we don't know what the range of Paranthropus boisei was. I think it's racingly unlikely that it was confined to the East African Rift Valley and the sites that are associated with it. But we don't know its range, but we do know that its range included the sites where it is found, but those sites where it is found they're not an indication of the limits of its range. And likewise, after it disappears from the Omo-Shungura Formation, it could persist in other parts of Africa for a length of time, which we just don't know. And likewise, before its appearance in those sediments, it could have been in parts of Africa that for which we don't have a hominin fossil record. And I've been working with René Bobet, who's the brains behind that partnership, and with Andrew Dew, who's also the brains behind that partnership. And basically, you can get some sense of the error in the first appearance date and the last appearance date. And the sense in the error largely depends on whether there are any fossil sites, where there are no hominins before the first appearance date, and whether there are any fossil sites where there are no hominins after the last appearance date. One of the other problems with hominins is that they are rare. They are rare. They are between sort of 0.5% or 1.5% of the mammals in the fossil record. So they are rare. One of the interesting things is that there are more Boisei specimens in the Turkana Basin than there are early Homo. So if numbers of fossils is a reflection of the population size, Boisei was there in greater numbers than early Homo. So I just want to offer you just a few consumer warnings when you look at evidence for hominin evolution. So where the fossil evidence is recovered is not necessarily where the action was. There is a tendency to sort of think that the Middle Awash and the Turkana Basin, there's a sort of Middle Awash Garden of Eden hypothesis, and there's a Turkana Basin Garden of Eden hypothesis. But there's absolutely no reason to think that hominin evolution was the crucible of hominin evolution. Consumer warning number 2 is that first and last appearance dates are complicated. There are almost certainly first appearance dates are going to get earlier and last appearance dates are going to get later. And they are complex phenomena that are not conducive to simpler explanations. An event, people talk about, the appearance of this. Events are what processes look like when they're sampled discontinuously. So we need to be aware, not just get sort of terribly excited by what we describe as an event, the beginning of something. It's not the beginning of anything. And the last one is a quote from Albert Szent-Györgyi, who was a very distinguished scientist who won the Nobel Prize, who said, simple solutions to complex biological problems are almost certainly wrong. I'm pretty sure he's right. So Paranthropus boisei, the metaphor I like to use is that Paranthropus boisei was living in this house. Its range We don't know how many rooms there are in the house. We have windows into some rooms, but the rooms with windows probably, it's just a small, it's just a minority of the rooms in the house. Our job is to try and get better views through the existing windows and to find new fossil sites, which are effectively new windowed rooms. In other words, previously windowless rooms become rooms with windows. So that's our job. I'm really impressed. In the middle of the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain died. And Winston Churchill was an adversary of Neville Chamberlain. But when he eulogized Chamberlain, he made the point that it's too soon to tell what Neville Chamberlain's, how he will be considered by history. And Churchill writes, he said, history with its flickering lamp stumbles along the trails of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes to revive its echoes and kindle with pale gleams the passions of former days. That's what we do as paleoanthropologists. The flickering lamps change. When I was a student, they were pretty crude. Now they're immensely more sophisticated, but they're still flickering, even though they're more expensive and they're more sophisticated. And so I just wanted to talk about a taxon, a hominin taxon that I'm enthusiastic about. I really fancy that Camilla's enthusiastic about Paranthropus Boisea as well. And I just want to thank Camilla for her extraordinary work guiding the Leakey Foundation. I want to thank all the previous presidents of the Leakey Foundation. And I want to thank you all for putting up with my incompetence at advancing the slides. I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Wood. I'm actually going to open the floor to one person to ask one question, and that person is Camilla. Do you have a question for our guest speaker?
I know your wonderful book, your small book on evolution, which I think is so wonderful and concise. And I agree with you that it's so interesting to know, who these other hominins were. And I loved the first part of your presentation about the early people who were putting the great apes together, and they did it through blood, and and through albumin, as you pointed out, before we had the great tools of the genome and genetic studies. And what's interesting is that they sort of corroborated what early scientists had done.
Yeah.
And I love, we've been putting together a book for the 50th anniversary of the Leakey Foundation, and we have chosen 50 important finds in paleoanthropology in the last 50 years. And one of them, one of the first ones is Zinj. And that was the first name given to Boisea. And it was revolutionary, and it's what showed everyone that our origins were in Africa, even though that's not a line ancestor.
Sure.
So
Well, I just hope that you might be interested in these little meanderings down the lanes to, and I think the story of Albert Leighton, latterly Grunbaum, I think humanizes the his his role and his predicament.
Yes. Yeah, it's so wonderful. And I am so grateful. You know, I found your presentation just fascinating as always, because you know, every time you learn about a little bit of these of the early scientists, it gives you an idea of how working in the dark we still are.
Sure, sure. I mean, you know, there's a lot we don't know. And I try and convince the students that, you know, we're not trying to find out things, we're trying to reduce our ignorance.
Right.
And I think that's important.
Right.
And lastly, Camilla, I just want you to be impressed by my tie. I actually found a tie. And let me stand up because this is, these are smart pants too. Okay. This is not just a, you know, an above the waist makeover. This is
You did the whole thing.
the whole 9 yards. Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wood, and thank you, Camilla.